Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to our speaker. So Robin Durham, MSW, LICSW, is an assistant professor of social work in the Master Social Work program at Concord University. Prior to being hired to teach full-time in 2018, Robin practiced as a licensed independent clinical social worker for over 30 years, providing therapy in outpatient settings, including community mental health, school-based health, and private psychiatric clinics. She's also served as an adjunct faculty for the Concord University Bachelor of Social Work program for several years, and she is a National Association of Social Workers member and has served on the West Virginia NASW State Board of Directors as regional representative and president. In addition to teaching, Robin is working towards her DSW through the University of Kentucky and provides clinical social work or clinical supervision to social workers seeking LICSW status and continuing education programs for social workers. So we are very excited to have Robin with us, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her.
Well, thank you for everybody for having me here. I want to just go and give you a disclaimer. I do not claim to be an expert, but I do clinical supervision and have for several years. And so what I hope to bring into this is just a very short version of things we need to think about ethically in providing it. And so again, if you have questions, please put them out there and we'll address them. And these slides are going to be available for you all as well. I'm not going to really read through the agenda, but this is kind of generally what we're going to talk about today. I will tell you, if you haven't had the clinical supervision training to be a clinical supervisor, if you'll reach out to me, I try to schedule them when there's enough people who are interested. So again, my email and contact is at the end. So when we think about, clinical social work practice, I mean, this has been something we've had now for many, many years. It is a very specialized practice. So we're asking people to go from, very generalist social work practice to clinical, but at the same time, we still keep, I think, our generalist approach to what we're doing, because we have to kind of wear a lot of hats. So when we're thinking about, what we're providing very, very, detailed, important interpersonal services to folks, whether it be individuals, families, groups, however, whatever the platform is. The reason we do what we do is, I just think it's a big deal. I think we're asking people to invite us into their lives and to work with very personal, very, sometimes very traumatic things in their lives. When we think about supervision, it's quite different than just licensed supervision. So we're not just saying, okay, are you meeting your hours, you're doing this? We're getting in there with the person we're supervising. And I'll talk more about that later, but we want to help them. So, most of us, when we graduate with this general toolbox of things that we have that we can use. I think clinical supervision is our opportunity to give the supervisees more specific tools that they can use with the clients that they're seeing. And at the same time, it is about protecting clients ultimately. We don't want somebody out there doing practices or, things that are harmful to clients in any way. And there's people certainly who could do that unintentionally, and there could be people who are intentional. And then, we are gatekeepers of the profession. Just because somebody wants to do clinical social work doesn't mean that they should. And it may be that they eventually can, but maybe they need more time. Maybe they need more instruction or training or whatever that is. Because at the end of this, we're saying that we're putting our stamp and saying, I'm saying that this person is ready for independent clinical practice. And so that's, to me, I don't know about you all, that's a really big deal for me to think about. When we think about the why, I mean, most people who are pursuing this have graduated and want to jump right into doing their clinical licensure stuff. It could be that you get somebody who maybe is switching. I had one person who had worked in healthcare for many, many years and was hired in a intensive geriatric program, day program. And so they had to have clinical licensure. So they had great social work experience, but they had very little in clinical social work. Most other people that I supervise have, again, just graduated and they're jumping right into it. So you can have a kind of a variance of what that looks like. We're supposed to provide oversight in what we're doing. And I'll talk about some of the risks and things in here in a little bit, but first of all, we're doing it through teaching, direct teaching. So maybe there's a skill that they don't know how to do, or so it could be involved that we teach them directly, we have them take a training and we talk through that. It could be, anything. involved in that. I think this next one is really important, and I hope that people feel comfortable doing it, is sharing our own practical experiences. We've had our successes and we've had our flops. And I think that it's just important to be vulnerable and be willing to talk about that with our supervisees, because we don't want them to feel, one, that they have to be perfect, and that they can't make mistakes. And we certainly don't want them to feel like they can't talk to us about things that might be an issue for them. So most of us have probably stepped in lots of piles of stuff along the way. And I think it's good to, again, talk about that and what we've learned from it. And then again, we are mentoring. Along the way, and what we hope happens is that person that we're supervising maybe feels at the end of the supervision that they still can reach out if they have an issue. Because that's a good thing when we have colleagues that we can do that with. I'm not going to read all these. These are just NASW, ASWB came out with best practice standards, and it's been out for a hot minute, so probably wouldn't hurt for an update. But it talks about these kind of domains that we need to look at: is the context in which supervision happens, and these are things that I think that, well, I shouldn't say I think, we need to be aware of and taking on clinical supervision. How it happens, what happens during it, the legal and the licensing issues that can go around, ethics, always, and technology, because we know COVID, it forced us all to make a quick switch, and we didn't get to do that with a lot of training. So we have to then again work with our supervisees and as well as ourselves to how to best incorporate technology, and when maybe we shouldn't. Any questions so far? Okay. The one thing I will say about this, when we talk about the context of supervision, I had several conversations with Vicki James at the board, and part of what we need to be looking at too, as we're taking on somebody for supervision, is, are they even working in a clinical setting or in a clinical position? And then we need to understand, first of all, where are they already licensed? Are they at the LGSW or LCSW levels? And what does that allow them to do? So, we're just thinking about, we have to kind of look at, you don't want to take on somebody who's really not doing clinical work, because it's going to get denied by the board anyway. When we think about, and you look under each one of these, there's different things, and the legal stuff is kind of a thing I'll talk about later. We have to kind of be on top of that stuff in terms of, what's allowed, has anything changed? And because the biggest thing that you'll see is we're taking on liability for the supervision that we're doing. Unlike regular license supervision, this one's a big deal. And the next slide, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. One of the things I wanted folks to think about is, okay, there we go. All right. I've done several of the pre-service trainings for the license supervision, and I'm not saying many people have said this, but there's been a few that I've gotten the impression that people are looking at this as an income stream. What I would say to you is, yes, you should be able to be reimbursed for what you do. However, this is huge. We are taking on direct liability for what people do. So if I'm supervising somebody in a different agency or in my own agency, and I either give them faulty supervision or something not addressed, that comes back on me and my license as well. And I don't say that to scare people off from doing clinical supervision, but I want you to go into this with eyes open about this is big. And one of the things, there's been, we know that we live in a society where people can sue. And so there's, the direct liability that we can look at. So we gave an inappropriate recommendation. And I think where this falls in is, as we're deciding about taking on supervision, are we supervising somebody that's doing stuff that's outside of our scope of practice or outside of our expertise? And that's something to think about, because again, it's us guiding them along the way. So the vicarious, and this is the little bit scary part too, and this is why we want I guess, somebody who's willing to talk to us about what they're doing, is things that they do that are wrong or that they fail to do. Those also can fall back on us. And here's the, if you notice down here, where this part here, this is the part that kind of keeps me up at night sometimes, that they're held to the same standard of care as we are. So even though they might be fresh out of graduate school, if I've been doing this for over 30 years, they're held to my level of practice. And so that's a little bit scary to me. I don't know about you all, but so we have to, again, take this very seriously and not look at it as just, okay, I can do a bunch of supervision and generate income, but this is specific and again, carries some heavy weights to it. So when we think about the managing risks, and you can see these for yourself, but when we think about the services, they meet or exceed standards of practice. So we need to be thinking about, okay, what are the standards of practice for the area that they're working in, whether it be in substance use disorders, general mental health, specific mental health treatments, things like that. As with anything, guys, documentation. And that falls on us to do. I took on a new supervisee who had previous supervision, and they told me that we were talking, and they said, well, you want me to keep the notes of our meetings and give those to you? I was like, no. As supervisors, we need to be keeping those. And, certainly we want folks to be able to, Lord have mercy, I don't even know what that is. We want folks to be able to look at, them and see what's in them, but we need to maintain that. What are they doing? How are we monitoring what they're doing? If you're in the same agency, I think it's a bit easier to do that. But if you're not in the same agency, then it's a little tougher. And I think of this in terms of, what's going on in terms of, distance supervision, when you really don't get eyes on people very much at all. Actions, and this is the thing, when we talk about, a lot of people will say that they're very uncomfortable with dealing with colleagues who may be acting unethically, unprofessionally, or impairment, things like that. But as supervisors, we've got to be okay with talking about that stuff. So if you have maybe a supervisee who's telling you about a situation that should have been mandated reporting and they didn't do it, then we need to make sure that gets done. If we're seeing a supervisee maybe who's crossing some boundaries, then again, we've got to be able to address that. And it's not about being mean or rude. It's about, again, shaping professional practice. If we're seeing them doing, things that maybe are impairing them in any way, and that doesn't, a lot of people will jump to and say, well, that's, maybe substance use and abuse. Well, yeah, but lots of things could potentially cause impairment. So maybe you've got a supervisee who is really just burning out. They're not taking time off, or they're not self-care, or maybe they're going through a personal problem that's coming into it. So again, we've got to have that ability to help guide them to the things that they need to do to take care of themselves. And that might be also that we recommend that they take time off, or that that they shouldn't practice for a period of time. And then again, we need to make sure that we're covered in terms of our own liability insurance and what that coverage looks like, that it does allow for supervision, and that it's enough coverage. Because again, you hope to never be sued, but who knows? Okay. All right, so when we think about it, again, we know it's a liability. Well, first of all, no brainer, we have to follow the code of ethics. But what I find, and I don't know those of you that have done supervision or those of you who are teaching, sometimes people are not really reading it. They're like, okay, I read the 2017 code of ethics. Well, we're in the 2021 version. So I think we have to, we're following it, but also we're very much needing to integrate that into supervision. That we may even say, okay, when you read this section, we're going to talk about it during our next supervision meeting, to try to take it apart. Because the other things we know is, when you practice for a little bit of time or a long time, we know that one, the code is not black and white. It's not a rule book that says you can and can't do this, and that context plays a big part of it. So we might end up a lot of times helping our supervisees navigate those changes in context. Like if you have a supervisee who's providing services in a residential setting, that's going to look a lot different than somebody who's doing it in an outpatient setting. So helping them kind of look at that. We do have the ability to help them practice ethically. And again, this goes back to working in rural areas has its own problems in terms of we run into our clients, different coworkers and agencies. So helping people navigate and set and maintain healthy boundaries so that they don't get into trouble for those boundary violations. Because again, some can be very unintentional, and unfortunately, some can be intentional. The other thing, most of you may or may not know this, West Virginia has been on board for several years now that ethical violations are published on the website. And, I'm really okay with that. Because if I'm going to go, if I'm a client, I'm going to go see somebody, I want to see if they've gotten in trouble for something. I think I have the right to do that. So we have to help, again, our supervisees understand this is a big deal. It puts your name out there. It also puts your license in jeopardy if you're not practicing ethically. And then again, we just know as the longer we practice that there's such a difference between ethics, law, policy, the real world. I mean, so sometimes those things play well in the sandbox together. Sometimes those things throw sand at each other and do not play well in the sandbox together. And so there can be real dilemmas between, well, ethics says this, agency policy says this, but law says this. And it can be difficult for our supervisees to navigate that. For example, I was a person I knew who was, and I wasn't supervising them, but they talked to me about, their school counselor, and they were told by their principal that they were under no circumstances to make a CPS report. If a kid told them something, they were to bring it to the principal, and the principal would decide if the report got made. Well, that's quite a sticky and icky ethical situation for them, because ethics says you make the report, you make sure it's done. However, they've got policy set by the principal that says, no, this is the way it's going to happen. So there can be those issues. Another one, and this wasn't so much an ethics thing as it was a practice thing. One of my supervisees worked in a small program, and it was a 2-story house. They were upstairs with a client. When they came down, everybody was gone. Left them there by themselves. And so we talk about how, again, the safety issues along with that, but also the potential ethical problems with that. So part of this is, it's not just about what we say, but it's really about what we do. And this is, again, I think where we really need to be able to share that we're modeling this stuff. And so maybe when we face an ethical dilemma, we talk about that with our supervisees in terms of what that looks like. And we need to, again, have them be willing to share with us what's going on and what they're struggling with. Anything so far? And again, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat, and I don't mind to stop and answer it. Okay. So what I thought I would do is just pick some of the things that, and these are not all of them, but to talk about, and I did self-care first. It's not that that's the only thing that's important, but of the supervisor and supervisee, we've got to be taking care of ourselves in this too. But a lot of times we know that self-care is a buzzword, and people are almost like, oh, self-care, but it's a real deal, because not everybody's going to recognize that maybe they're headed into, some dangerous territory in terms of burnout or compassion fatigue, or for some people, depending on the work they're doing, maybe even secondary traumatization. So we want to be very upfront about, okay, what are you doing? Like one of my supervisees was notorious. She'd work through lunch. I was like, nope, we're not doing that no more. Because, those of you that do counseling all day long, it's mentally exhausting. It's emotionally exhausting. And to not even take a break for lunch, that's, no, not good self-care. So really, again, we need to demonstrate it. So we can't sit and pull the do as I say, not as I do. So we can talk about the ways that maybe we're using self-care, but also help them come up with some practical things, because, it's great to say, well, I'm going to go on vacation. That's a big grand gesture, but what are some other things that they can do that are smaller and more manageable more frequently? And we know that, that when we get burned out or traumatized, that can certainly lead to impairment when you can't do what you need to do. The documentation, this is on a couple of fronts. And one of the things I would tell you, and I may have put this somewhere else, make sure when you go to take on supervision, if they're not in your agency, but I guess even if they are, that you have access to documentation. I had one agency, a social worker, reach out and say she wanted supervision, but the agency would not allow me access to their documentation, like her notes or treatment plans. I was like, can't do it. Can't do it. Because I need to see what you're writing. I need to see how you're writing. So we have to help them maintain that, and we can't do that if we don't see it. So part of it is language. You may have a supervisee that doesn't know what they're writing is not okay. They may have to learn how to write descriptive information differently. So talking to them about what appropriate versus derogatory language looks like. Like even something saying the client was combative. Well, what does that mean? Because if somebody else looks at that, they're going to make all kinds of, they're going to have all kinds of ideas about what that means. So my thing would be able to say, okay, let's don't write the client was combative. Tell me what was going on with their behavior. Well, they refuse to answer questions. Well, that's different than combative, at least the way I understand combative. Our responsibility in terms of how records are handled. I don't know that it's, well, I guess it still could be a big deal, but maybe you have a supervisee who has remote access to their work computer from home. What are they doing to protect the confidentiality of those records from the devices that they're using? Are they still using paper records and they're taking them home in the evenings and writing in those? Do the records reflect the services that they delivered and what they're supposed to be doing? So that's part of what we're trying to do. And so, and following that, we're saying, okay, there's certainly state and federal laws that we have to look at, in terms of how things should be documented and that sort of thing. But there's also potentially issues with like payers. One insurance company may require certain documentation and another one. So it's helping them understand those pieces of it as well. The boundaries are a big one, dual relationships, inappropriate relationships. I don't know why in this day and age we still have people that think that sexual, physical relationships are okay. I just cannot ever wrap my head around that, but they do. But the bigger thing, so we want to help them understand, one, just start with conflicts of interest. When there's a conflict of interest, like it's not just a conflict of interest because you might have went to school with somebody. I graduated with 400 people. That doesn't mean I knew them all. Now, if that was a best friend, an ex-relationship, there you go. It's a relative. So helping them understand when something truly is a conflict of interest, and then maybe help them figure out how to navigate that. Maybe their agency doesn't really see that as a big deal. And so, talking with the supervisee about how to approach their agency, how they can maybe, do that in a way that doesn't come across as too aggressive. We could certainly offer to assist them with it once we've helped them try to do that on their own. The other things, just again, about relationships and harassment, things like that, just again, helping them understand, because those may seem like no-brainers to most of us, but people still get in trouble for it. So it's not a no-brainer. The relationship, for example, you might have a supervisee who's dating their work supervisor or their boss. Okay, yeah, they're grown-ups, they're allowed to make those choices, but to talk about what that might look like, or they may be serving as a supervisor and dating somebody that they're supervising. And it's not that we say to them you can't do it, but to help them understand why that might be an issue in terms of that relationship. I'll talk about this a little bit later when we get into the contract stuff. First of all, the nature of this is, so the supervisees should never be practicing independently. So what that means is if you're going to be off for a period of time, whether it be on vacation or maybe sickness or personal leave, then there needs to be something in place to say, okay, that you're not providing that supervision at that point. And they cannot do what they're doing. So having something in place for, is there a backup person who's going to take over while you're off on leave? Because it's again, they can't do it. They can't do it. It's not just being attentive. If you say, okay, we're going to meet every Tuesday at 6 p.m. That's not adequate, because what if they have an emergency on Thursday at 9 a.m.? So you need to be thinking in place of, okay, we have our regular supervision meetings, but not everything can wait until our regular supervision meetings. So thinking about what do you have in place that covers that? And again, we can talk about that when we get to the contract stuff. We have to, again, emergency arrangements. So is there somebody, like if I am going to be on vacation and not going to, for whatever reason, not going to do supervision, is there another LICSW who's going to step in and do that? And what does that look like? Much like the client stuff, there's a point where this should be over. Most of the time, supervision is over a 2-year period. Now, within that 2-year period, they have to meet the 3,000 hours of work time. So we plan for, at the end of 2 years, not before 2 years, at the end of 2 years, if they've met their 3,000 hours and all of their supervision requirements, that they are ready then to sit for the test. But something could happen. Like, for example, maybe, let's say you have someone who takes family leave for whatever reason, and now they've got 3 or 4 months there that they've not been working, then that means obviously that supervision is going to have to go forward. It's not going to be done in 2 years. But also, let's think about unplanned terminations and endings. Maybe you work for the same agency and the person quits or gets fired. There's got to be some discussion about what happens in that circumstance. And I think it goes back to what goes into your contract. What happens if you feel like you've got a supervisee who is not being responsive to your direction and your the consulting that you're doing with them? There might be a time when you decide to end supervision. Another one, and I can't remember if I put this in here or not, but talking about fees. If you have fees in there and you say, okay, they will pay X amount per every supervision. Yes, Shannon, I'm sure we'll do that. If you are, and you say, okay, I'm going to charge you X amount per session. And what happens if they can't pay that? What do you have in place for that? So Shannon asked, supervising part-time employee. Yes, it will take way longer than 2 years to get their clinical hours. I have one of those too. She only sees about 20, maybe 15 to 20 clients a week. So again, we have to build that in that, and it may be that, because if you think about it, supervision is you provide an hour of supervision for about every 30 hours of practice. So if people are full-time, you're probably meeting once a week. If people are working very part-time, it may be every 2 weeks or something like that. So yes, our supervisees need to understand that it's the 3,000 hours and at least 2 years. Shannon, does that kind of answer what you're thinking about? Oh, okay, thanks. Okay. I mentioned the technology, again, here to stay. I will tell you, I'm a little biased about it, don't love it. I mean, I understand the benefits that it poses, and it certainly poses a great benefit for supervision. We can use HIPAA compliant technologies to provide supervision, and that's considered face-to-face supervision. We do have to weigh the pros and cons. As the supervisor, you're responsible for the platform. So you would be the one who would have to make sure that you're using a HIPAA compliant technology to do it. But can the supervisee do it? Can they get on there? Can you do the things that you need to do? So it may require helping them learn how to screen share so that you can read notes and read treatment plans online. the assuring for privacy and confidentiality. I've seen people get a little too flip about meetings and whatnot. They're out eating and they're talking to somebody about stuff. Where are meetings taking place? Where is your supervisee when you're meeting? Much like where clients are. Where are you when you're providing the meetings? Because we are talking about case stuff. We're talking about clients' information. And it doesn't matter that people around us don't recognize a name, but you know what? They can recognize a circumstance. So that may be part of what we're doing, is saying meetings can only take place if you're in your office, whether it be home office or work office, and they're in an office as well, where there's, again, privacy can be assured. Technical issues, which we know are going to happen. It just is going to happen. So, what happens? Is it a case of, okay, if you get disconnected, do you follow up with a phone call? Do you try to reconnect to the video platform first? What do you do with that? Jurisdiction issues. Okay, so I know that things probably will change in the future, but much like what we're looking at with services, when we think about services, so I'm a licensed social worker in West Virginia. I am not licensed in Virginia. So unless I have permission from the Virginia Board of Social Work, I can't provide services if a client is there. I had this happen over the summer where I work at Concord. I see a couple of counseling students, and one went home to Pennsylvania. So I had to contact Pennsylvania, get their permission. But same can hold true when we talk about supervision. You might get a request to supervise somebody in another state, or during the whole supervision thing, you may move to another state. And yes, you might get a license in that state, but it may mean that you have to keep your license here. So what I would tell you with that, when it's about supervision, is if there's going to be any kind of change at all, whether it's the supervisee moving or you moving, get with the board, notify them, and let them make a decision about what needs to happen next. I know that there's a thing out there about the whole social work licensure compact, where there's going to be advocating for license reciprocity, and that's all well and good. However, I think there's going to be some issues in terms of every state is different in terms of legal requirements and practice requirements. So if you do have a license, or you can supervise in multiple states, you then also, again, have to be very aware of everything that's involved in that. Going back to the managing liability, what are the laws? What are their agency policies? Everything. And then the limits of, there could be, you might have a supervisee who doesn't live in an area that has great internet connectivity. It's not great at all. It could be that you don't live in an area that has great internet connectivity. But also, kind of the last thing on that is the supervisee using technology to provide services, and what does that look like? Again, total bias alert here. I'll tell you that right now. It's gotten very easy, I think, to use technology. And I've heard a lot of providers say, well, I love it. I'm not going back. I'm going to keep using it. Just because we love it doesn't mean it's best for the client. So is our supervisee using, what are they doing to assess that using technology is really best for their client's needs? And what does that look like? Or are they just doing it because they can? So we have to, again, address that. Because I have real concerns about, where are supervisees? How do we assure for privacy and confidentiality in their settings? And what does that look like? So that's another area we want to, again, go into with our supervisees. One of the things we want to think about is I kind of briefly mentioned this too. We certainly have our areas that we are competent and maybe even expert in some areas. So we want to have the skills to provide the supervision to the person in terms of what they're needing, but also, learning how to do clinical supervision. I don't know about you all, but way back in the day, they just gave me somebody in my agency and they just did it. I will tell you, when in putting together the clinical supervision training, it has changed the way I'm going to approach it. Gave me so much more to think about in terms of, because typically, like, I didn't use a separate contract. I used the one through the board. I'll be using a separate contract. But it also gave me ideas about how to supervise. There's so many different ways to do it, so many different styles that we can do that with. So that we learn how to do supervision, but also that we are able to supervise, and we have the competence in the areas that we're supervising. For example, one of my supervisees she's also trained in trauma-focused CBT. And while I know about it, I've used CBT and I've certainly worked with people with trauma. I'm not trained in that. So she's getting additional supervision from somebody else in just that. And then we're doing the other stuff. So it could be a situation like that. Just our ethical considerations in terms of the supervision we provide, and I'm not going to go through those, but that we're trying to help them get connected to needed trainings. And so if they're being asked to do, well, let's just go with this. They're being asked to diagnose. And an LGSW is not supposed to diagnose independently. So we need to be working with them on trainings that can help them learn it, but also work with them on how did you diagnose? What did you use for that? What symptoms? And getting out the DSM and spending that time with them, because we want them to use it responsibly and give clients, when we have to give those labels, we want them to have the most accurate one they can have. I included dishonesty and fraud and deception, because what we don't want to do is say we're supervising somebody we're not, or say that they're able to provide a service and they're not. So that's again where you want to be careful. And then again, the confidence that they have both in the work that they're doing directly, but also helping them understand how to become more culturally competent. And that cultural competence, in my mind, is not a end of the, you do it and you're done. It's kind of, you do it throughout your career. And again, just understanding their scope of practice. What are they allowed to do? And you can get this through the West Virginia Code, Section 3030, to kind of say, okay, here's what they should be doing and can do. Here's what they can't. We're getting close. Okay. So this is where I wanted to spend a hot minute. So like I said, I will from future on be doing a specific supervision contract. And there's lots of examples out there. But one, it protects you. It protects your supervisee. To some degree, it might protect the agency, but really it's about protecting the client in terms of what's allowed, what's not. How does this work? It is really recommended whether I would do it whether working in the same agency or not, because you need to be clear about, let's say you're not their administrative supervisor, but you feel like you're being pushed to be their administrative supervisor. Clinical supervision and administrative are a bit different. So we need some clear direction on what that looks like. The roles, the purpose, what we're supposed to do, what are the objectives, what do you want to come out of it, but also what does the supervisee want from it? And supervisees are very different. You might have some that are just uber prepared. They come with questions, they come with cases. You have other ones that just show up. So it might be that part of the contract is they have to be prepared with certain things, whether it be they bring a case to every supervision or whatever. And again, the expectations, who does what, who's responsible for what. These are just some things to think about. Certainly expectations, fees, and financial arrangements. And like I said, you are allowed to be paid for your time, but here's what I would encourage you to do. Think about this. Think about your own situation when you got supervision and what was that like, and maybe you paid for it, maybe you didn't. But we need to be looking at this also, is it sustainable? This is over at least 2 years. Okay, so once a week, potentially they're meeting, so 4 times a month over 2 years. And so I think when we look at fees and financial arrangements, if we know from the get-go that that's not sustainable, then I don't think it's ethical for us to enter into doing supervision. And that's kind of my personal take on it. So then we might need to reconsider, what do those fees look like? And there is no direction from the state about what fees are. And I don't think they want to touch that. But I've heard some pretty horrific things about what people have paid for supervision. The state rules and regulations. So you go to the social work board and find out, again, what do you have to do? What needs to be happening? And that goes back to at least 2 years, 3,000 hours, and no less than 2 years. And then part-time looks different. Again, knowing that you have to meet, 1 hour for every 30 hours of practice. knowing the difference between how many hours are individual and how many can be done in a group setting and how many can be done in like non-face-to-face, for example, just chart review. The emergency contacts and guidelines for rescheduling, that they just can't call on the day of and say, I can't make it today. It's like, no, we can't do that. The documentation record keeping, the board gives you kind of a form to use. It's pretty vague. So if there's a way for you to make it, you can personalize a little bit, make it more specific in terms of what you put on it. But you want it to be kind of like a client record. You want it to be accurate. You want it to contain the information. Like, so if you advise your supervisee to do a task, like you advise them to call in a CPS report, then you need to make sure you followed up on that. If you advise them to take a specific training, then that's in your documentation. Then you need to show that you followed up on that. That again, you have access to their documentation. You know, if you're going to use, and right now the state, we don't use any kind of formal evaluations, but if you want to use kind of a formal evaluation and feedback, that needs to be in the contract, what you're going to do, how often you're going to do it. I do think it's coming. I think there will at least be an annual evaluation. We're just not sure what that's going to look like yet. Talking about confidentiality and other legal requirements. You know, we know a lot of times in our state, it's threats to kill self or others, any kind of abuse or neglect against a child or vulnerable adult. But a lot of times, and this is confusing because the West Virginia Code says we have social worker privilege. We don't really have social worker privilege in the state to where we can say, oh, I'm not going to take this to court. Again, ethics, and then discussing, you know, what would constitute planned termination of supervision and what might be something that would be like, okay, unplanned. Like if you don't follow X, Y, and Z, then I will not continue supervision. I listed just a few here. You can look up your own. The ones I love have things, they're very specific, but they have things like, what are the rights and responsibilities of the supervisor and what are the rights and responsibilities of the supervisee? But these are just different templates you can look at to give you some guidance, because like I said, you get the one from the state that has, you know, some general stuff, but you need something, I think, much more specific. And I think these will give you a nice overview of what those would look like. So, you know, and you may find other ones. Again, eventually, I know we're working on kind of a clinical supervision manual that will have some of this stuff in it, but it's not ready yet. So as we get closer to that, we can make some recommendations about, here's some things that, you know, here might be a really good sample supervision contract. Here's some different documentations styles that you can use with your people. But again, we're just not there yet. Okay. So really I wanted to leave a little bit of time at the end. So, you know, here's, I mean, different references, everything I used here, my contact information. So I really just want to open it up for a few minutes for folks, specific questions, because I know I covered a lot of stuff really fast.
So if you have
really,
questions, yeah, I was just gonna say,
yeah.
so if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself. In the meantime, I'm also going to just post in the chat window a link to our evaluation survey. So if you have some time to do that before you leave today, that would be great. So somebody was asking if you could reshare your references and contact info.
Yes. Well, where'd it go? Yes, I will. Yes, as I get it pulled up. Hold on. There we go. Yep. And if you have, I mean, really, if you have another question, just go put it out there too. I'm kind of old school. I like the talking part. I'm not seeing anything. I've got it open too. I don't see anything yet, so it's fine. Again, I will tell you, if you need to take the supervision, I know that other folks have it. The other schools of social work have it. I don't know if they've done any of it lately, but I just did one last month. I'll probably do one in the fall. And it's just a general supervision kind of course. It's the pre-service, the 6-hour one that's required for the state. So if you're interested, you can certainly email me, and I can put you on a list and let you know. Is there going to be a group for new super? Sarah, Susan, that's a really good question. I don't know of one. It doesn't mean somebody could not start one. But about, supervisor for support, that's a really good idea.
Well, thank you, Robin, so much. This is a really great presentation. And just as a reminder to folks, I know we said this in the chat and a couple times, but we will be emailing out a copy of the PowerPoint to everyone that has all the references and all these other great links to information. And I think that's it. And then again, if you have a minute to complete the evaluation survey, that would be great. For those of you who are staying for the field instructor appreciation event, just kind of hang out. We'll get started with that in just a minute. Does anybody have any final questions or comments for Robin before we let her go? No?
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank